The air outside the Grand Astoria Ballroom was sharp with the promise of a late autumn chill, a stark contrast to the manufactured warmth and muffled symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter seeping through the heavy oak doors. Julian Vance stood just beyond the spill of golden light, a ghost in a perfectly tailored but deliberately unremarkable black suit. He was a man who had once commanded rooms like the one inside. Now he preferred their periphery. The shadows were a comfortable cloak, a penance of his own design. He watched the city's elite drift by, their faces masks of practiced affability, their eyes hungry. He knew that hunger. It had once been his own. A sleek black sedan purred to a stop at the curb. A man with a florid face and a suit that strained at the buttons lumbered out, tossing his keys dismissively in Julian's direction without a second glance. The keys, heavy and cold, slapped against Julian's palm. The man's voice was a low growl, thick with entitlement. "Don't scratch it, pal. It's worth more than your house." Julian looked down at the keys, then at the man's retreating back. A bitter smile touched his lips. It was perfect, really. A perfect encapsulation of the world he had fled. He, Julian Vance, whose name had once been a synonym for innovation, whose face had graced the cover of business magazines, was now mistaken for a valet. He had come here tonight for one reason: to see Marcus Thorne, to look at the man who had taken everything, his company, his reputation, his very belief in the world, and see if the ensuing years had etched any semblance of guilt onto his smug face. To be treated as invisible was not just an irony, it was the point. He felt a rough shove from behind. Another guest, a younger man with slicked back hair and the cruel, empty eyes of inherited wealth, pushed past him. "Move it. You're blocking the entrance. Go park the cars. That's what they pay you for." The words were a physical blow. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced the cold armor of his detachment. He should have corrected them. He should have dropped the keys and walked away. He should have said his name and watched the color drain from their arrogant faces. But he didn't. Instead, a strange sense of resignation washed over him. He had built walls of wealth and power around himself for years. And for what? So they could crumble into this? A man holding another's keys in the cold, ordered around like a servant. Maybe this was what he deserved. He turned, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes, and took a step toward the long line of gleaming automobiles. One step toward embracing the anonymity he had so carefully cultivated. And then a voice, amplified and resonant, cut through the night air, carrying from the speakers flanking the ballroom entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. And now, to deliver our keynote address, a man whose vision has shaped the future of technology and whose generosity makes nights like this possible. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Julian Vance." The world seemed to stop. The man who had shoved him froze, his hand halfway to the door. The florid-faced man who had tossed him the keys paused on the top step, turning slowly. Their eyes, wide with disbelief and dawning horror, fixed on him. Julian stood frozen, caught between the suffocating warmth of the ballroom and the cold, open expanse of the parking lot. The spotlight found him, a brilliant, unforgiving circle of white that stripped away his shadows and held him pinned like an insect. He was no longer invisible. He was the center of everything. Would the man they thought was a valet shatter the steel walls he had built around his heart, or would he retreat back into the comfortable darkness? For the first time in 5 years, Julian Vance had no idea what he was going to do. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, deafening silence. The faces turned toward him were a blur of confusion and dawning recognition. He could see the frantic whispers ripple through the crowd on the steps, the frantic calculations happening behind their eyes. This was the man from the magazines, the recluse, the ghost of Silicon Valley. What was he doing out here? The security guard by the door, who had been watching him with suspicion, now looked pale and uncertain. Julian's mind raced. He had two choices. He could turn and walk away, disappear into the night and let them think it was all a bizarre mistake. He could get in his own car, a modest sedan parked 3 blocks away, and drive back to the sterile, echoing emptiness of his mansion, a fortress built to keep the world out. Or he could walk up those steps. He could walk into that room, face the beast he had fled, and see what happened when a ghost decided to speak. The keys in his hand felt impossibly heavy. He looked at them, the emblem of a luxury car glinting in the spotlight. He thought of the man's dismissive words. "It's worth more than your house." His own house, a sprawling estate overlooking the ocean, could buy this entire fleet of cars. The thought wasn't born of arrogance, but of a profound and sudden weariness with the lie he was living. He had been pretending to be small, pretending to be nothing, and the world had eagerly agreed with him. He let the keys fall from his hand. They clattered on the asphalt with a sound that seemed to echo in the charged silence. He straightened his shoulders, the simple movement feeling monumental. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket and began to walk. Each step up the marble stairs was a deliberate act of defiance against the man he had been for the last 5 years. The whispers grew louder as he passed, a chorus of his own name. He didn't look at any of them. His focus was on the open doors, the rectangle of light that felt like a portal back to a life he had tried to bury. Inside, the master of ceremonies was sweating under the stage lights, his smile frozen in a rictus of panic. He had clearly expected his keynote speaker to emerge from the wings, not from the valet line. As Julian reached the stage, the MC fumbled with the microphone, offering it to him with a hand that trembled slightly. Julian took the microphone. His own hand was perfectly steady. He walked to the center of the stage and looked out at the sea of faces. They were all there. The titans of industry, the political power brokers, the socialites, and in the center of it all, at the head table, was Marcus Thorne. Marcus, looking as polished and untouchable as ever, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. He lifted his glass in a mock toast, his eyes glittering with a challenge. "Go on," the look said. "Impress them." A wave of fury, cold and pure, washed through Julian. He had a speech prepared, or rather, his foundation's director had prepared one for him. It was the usual boilerplate nonsense about corporate responsibility and the power of philanthropy. Words that meant nothing, spoken to people who cared for nothing but the reflection of their own generosity. He could see the teleprompter at the back of the room, its hopeful text scrolling upward. He ignored it. He leaned into the microphone, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the cavernous room. "Good evening." The silence was absolute. "I was just outside. A man handed me his car keys. He told me not to scratch his car, that it was worth more than my house." A nervous titter went through the crowd. They thought it was a joke, a folksy opening gambit. Marcus's smile widened. "It wasn't a joke," Julian continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He believed it. He looked at me and saw someone who parks cars for a living, and in his world, that is the sum total of a man's worth. The value of his property, the cut of his suit." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He's not wrong. This room, this entire evening, is a monument to that belief. We are here tonight to raise money for the East Side Community Center, a place that provides meals for children, shelter for the homeless, and hope for people this world has forgotten to see." He gestured vaguely at the opulent floral arrangements, the glittering chandeliers. "We will write checks, and we will feel good about ourselves. We will congratulate ourselves on our charity. But the system that allows us to sit in this room, draped in jewels and fine fabrics, is the same system that necessitates the existence of places like that community center. We build our empires on a foundation of their struggle. We celebrate our success, which is often just the clever repackaging of someone else's failure. The mood in the room had shifted. The nervous laughter died. The faces were now masks of discomfort and thinly veiled hostility. He had their attention. He looked directly at Marcus Thorne. We talk about vision. We talk about innovation. But what is the value of a vision that sees profit but not people? What is the worth of an innovation that connects the world, but leaves us more disconnected from our own humanity than ever before? His voice grew stronger, infused with a passion he hadn't felt in years. I built a company on a simple principle: that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. That idea was considered inefficient, unprofitable. It was taken from me, repackaged, and sold to the highest bidder. And the man who did it sits in this room tonight, being celebrated for his business acumen. He didn't need to say the name. Every eye in the room darted toward Marcus Thorne. Marcus's smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. So, no, Julian said, his voice dropping again. I will not stand here and give you a speech about the virtues of giving back a fraction of what has been taken. Instead, I will ask you a question. When you leave here tonight and a man in a simple suit opens your car door, what will you see? Will you see a servant? Or will you see a human being with a life and a story as complex and valuable as your own? He placed the microphone carefully on the lectern. Thank you for your time. Without another glance at the stunned and silent crowd, he walked off the stage. He didn't head for the exit. He walked straight toward the bar, ordered a glass of water, and prepared for the storm he had just unleashed. For the first time in 5 years, he felt the exhilarating, terrifying sensation of being truly alive. The aftermath was a strange cocktail of reactions. A few people, mostly older philanthropists, who had seen it all, approached him with a grudging respect in their eyes. They offered a curt nod or a quiet, "Well said, Vance." Most, however, gave him a wide berth, their gazes a mixture of fear and contempt. He had broken the unspoken rules of their gilded world. He had spoken the truth in a place built on comfortable illusions. He was leaning against the bar, sipping his water, when a woman approached him. She was not one of the socialites. Her dress was simple, elegant, but understated, and her expression was not one of awe or anger. It was one of intense, focused scrutiny. "That was quite a speech, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "I'm told it wasn't the one on the teleprompter," he replied, a hint of a wry smile on his face. "No, it wasn't," she confirmed. "The one on the teleprompter was full of empty platitudes. Yours was full of something else. Anger." He looked at her properly for the first time. She had tired eyes, but they were clear and intelligent. There were faint lines of worry etched around them, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and real-world problems, not the manufactured dramas of the ballroom. "Anger is a motivator," he said simply. "Is it?" she challenged. "Or is it just noise? You stood on that stage and condemned everyone in this room. You made a grand dramatic gesture. But what does it change? Tomorrow the sun will rise, and my community center will still be facing eviction because the building was sold to a developer who wants to put up luxury condos." Julian's fleeting sense of victory evaporated, replaced by a familiar pang of cynicism. Of course, it was always about money. "And who is the director of this community center?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You're looking at her," the woman said, extending a hand. "Elena Morales." He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused. This was a woman who worked. Julian Vance. "I know who you are," she said, withdrawing her hand. "Everyone knows who you are now. The question is, are you the man who gives speeches, or are you a man who does something?" Her directness was like a splash of cold water. He was used to people who spoke in circles, who hinted and hedged. Elena Morales looked at him as if he were a problem to be solved, not a demigod to be placated. "What do you want from me, Ms. Morales?" "I want you to understand that your words, however satisfying they might have been for you to say, don't pay our heating bill. They don't stop Marcus Thorne's bulldozers." The name hit him like a physical blow. "Thorne? Thorne Development bought your building?" A look of grim understanding dawned on Elena's face. "Oh," she said softly, "so it's not just philosophical for you, it's personal." "You could say that," Julian said, his voice tight. The world suddenly felt very small. Of all the buildings in the city, Marcus had to buy hers. It was as if the universe was conspiring to drag him back into the fight he had tried so desperately to avoid. "Look," Elena said, her tone softening slightly. "I shouldn't have come at you like that. Your speech, it was honest. And honesty is a rare commodity in a room like this. But for the people I serve, honesty doesn't put food on the table." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Come and see it. Come and see what you're supposedly raising money for tonight. Don't just talk about it from a stage. See it with your own eyes. Then you can decide if you're the man who just talks." She wrote an address on a napkin and pushed it into his hand. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., if you're serious." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Julian looked down at the napkin. The ink was slightly smudged. It was just an address, a simple set of coordinates, but it felt like a map to a place he had forgotten existed. A place where actions mattered more than words. A place where he would have to confront not only Marcus Thorne's legacy, but his own. The next morning, Julian stood across the street from the address on the napkin. The East Side Community Center was a squat brick building, a relic from another era sandwiched between a boarded-up laundromat and a check-cashing store. The windows were clean, but the brick was crumbling at the edges. A colorful, hand-painted mural of children holding hands covered one wall, a vibrant splash of hope against the urban decay. It was a world away from the gleaming glass and steel towers he used to build. He had spent the night in his cavernous, silent home, the echoes of his own speech mocking him. Elena's words had burrowed under his skin. "Are you the man who gives speeches, or are you a man who does something?" For 5 years, he had done nothing. He had managed his fortune, read books, and nursed his grievances in splendid isolation. He had become a spectator in his own life. Taking a deep breath that tasted of city exhaust and faint fried onions, he crossed the street. The front door was propped open with a worn-out copy of a phone book. As he stepped inside, he was hit by a wave of sound and smell. The chatter of children, the low murmur of adults, the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on linoleum. The air smelled of chalk dust, strong coffee, and something savory cooking in a distant kitchen. It was chaotic, loud, and vibrantly alive. A little girl with 2 long braids and enormous, curious brown eyes stopped bouncing a red ball and stared at him. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice high and clear. Julian was taken aback. I don't think so. I'm looking for Elena Morales." "She's my mom," the girl announced proudly. "She's in the office. It's the one with the door that sticks." She pointed down a hallway lined with children's artwork. "I'm Lily." "It's nice to meet you, Lily," Julian said, a genuine smile forming on his face for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I'm Julian." "Julian," she repeated, testing the name. "Okay. Mom's busy. She's yelling at the phone." As if on cue, Elena's voice, sharp and frustrated, carried from the office. "No, I don't understand. We were told we had until the end of the month. A week? That's impossible." Julian walked down the hallway and paused at the open doorway. The office was a cluttered mess of paperwork, coffee cups, and half-finished grant proposals. Elena stood with her back to him, the phone pressed hard against her ear, her free hand clenched into a fist. This is a community institution. You can't just, hello, hello. She slammed the phone down with a cry of pure frustration and sagged against the desk, burying her face in her hands. Julian cleared his throat softly. Bad news? Elena's head snapped up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked exhausted, defeated. When she saw him, a flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by a weary resignation. Mr. Vance, you actually came. You invited me, he said, stepping into the tiny office. And please, call me Julian. Julian, she said, the name sounding foreign on her tongue. Well, you've come at a great time. You can have a front row seat to the end of everything. That was Thorne Development's legal department. They've moved up our eviction date. We have 1 week to vacate the premises. 1 week? Julian felt a familiar cold anger begin to burn in his chest. It was a classic Marcus Thorne move. Brute force, no finesse. Crush the opposition before they have time to organize. They're posting the notice this afternoon, Elena continued, her voice hollow. 1 week. Where am I supposed to send these people? The families who rely on our after-school program? The seniors who come for a hot meal because their pensions don't stretch far enough? Where do they go, Julian? She wasn't asking for an answer. She was venting, despairing. But her question hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. Julian looked past her, through the doorway, at the controlled chaos of the main room. He saw Lily teaching another little girl how to tie her shoes. He saw 2 elderly men playing a slow, deliberate game of chess. He saw a young woman at a computer, carefully filling out a job application. This wasn't an abstract concept of charity. This was a living, breathing ecosystem of need and support. It was real. Without thinking, he said, "They're not going anywhere." Elena looked at him, her expression a mixture of hope and deep-seated skepticism. What does that mean? Are you going to write a check? Because money can't stop a bulldozer when the legal paperwork is signed. No, he said, his mind already working, gears that had been dormant for years beginning to turn. Not a check. Marcus doesn't respond to money. He only understands leverage. He looked around the cluttered office, at the stacks of files and binders. May I see your lease agreement? And any correspondence you've had with Thorne Development? Elena stared at him for a long moment, searching his face. He met her gaze directly, letting her see the resolve that was solidifying within him. This was no longer just about his own wounded pride or his history with Marcus. It was about this place. It was about Lily. It was about the 2 old men playing chess. Slowly she nodded and began to dig through a teetering pile of folders. It's all here, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Everything. As she handed him the files, their fingers brushed. A small, unexpected jolt passed between them. It was a spark of connection in a world that had felt cold and empty for so long. For the first time, Julian wasn't just observing a problem from a distance. He was a part of it. And he was going to fix it. For the next 3 days, Julian practically lived at the community center. He arrived before the sun came up and left long after the last of the evening classes had finished. He converted a small, dusty storage closet into a makeshift command center, spreading out legal documents, zoning maps, and financial reports across a folding table. He worked with a singular focus that he hadn't felt since the early days of his first company, a relentless drive that had been buried under years of apathy. He wasn't Julian Vance, the reclusive billionaire. He was just Julian, the quiet man in the closet office who drank terrible coffee and seemed to understand the labyrinthine world of corporate law. The staff and regulars at the center quickly grew accustomed to his presence. They saw him not as a savior, but as an ally. He didn't make grand promises. He just worked. Elena watched him, her initial skepticism slowly melting away, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She saw the way he listened, truly listened, when one of the seniors told him about their pension problems. She saw the gentle way he helped Lily with her math homework, explaining fractions with a patience she rarely had time for herself. She saw a man who was methodical, brilliant, and surprisingly gentle. One evening, she found him staring at a complex flowchart he had drawn on a whiteboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. The center was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. "You look like you're planning a military invasion," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up, his eyes tired but bright. "Of a sort," he admitted. "Marcus has always been predictable. He uses a shell corporation to acquire the property, another to handle the legal filings, and a third to manage the construction bids. He thinks it insulates him, but it also creates vulnerabilities. If you can find a weak link in the chain, the whole structure can be compromised." "And have you found one?" she asked, her heart beating a little faster. "Maybe," he said, tapping a box on the flowchart labeled Evergreen Holdings. "This company. It's the one that officially holds the deed to this building. It's a ghost. No physical address, no listed officers. But it has to have a bank, a signatory. I'm trying to trace the money." Elena brought him a cup of coffee, sitting on the edge of the cluttered table. The small closet felt intimate, a pocket of quiet intensity in the sleeping building. "Why are you doing this, Julian?" "Really?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the whiteboard. "5 years ago," he began, his voice low, "Marcus Thorne was my partner, my best friend. We built a company from nothing, in a garage, just like the storybooks. Our founding principle was something we called ethical AI. The idea was to create systems that were transparent, accountable, and designed to augment human potential, not replace it." He took a sip of coffee, his gaze distant. It was working. We were on the verge of a breakthrough that would have changed everything, but it was slow. It was expensive. Marcus got impatient. He wanted the big payday. He went behind my back, sold our core technology to a military contractor, and pushed me out of my own company. He used a fabricated scandal to ruin my reputation, painted me as unstable and reckless. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He had everything. I had nothing but a fortune I no longer wanted and a name nobody would trust. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient pain. I didn't fight back. I just disappeared. I told myself it was a strategic retreat, that the world he was building wasn't one I wanted to be a part of. But the truth is, I was broken. He didn't just take my company, he took my faith in people. Coming here, seeing this place, it's the first time in 5 years I've seen something that feels like it's worth fighting for." Elena felt a profound wave of empathy for this quiet, wounded man. She had seen him as a symbol of the wealthy elite, another powerful man playing games. Now she saw the truth. He was in exile. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the table. "He didn't take everything, Julian," she said softly. "He didn't take this." She tapped his temple. "Or this." She touched the center of his chest. "You just forgot how to use them." His gaze met hers, and in that moment, the space between them shrank. The air grew thick with unspoken understanding. He was no longer just an ally. He was a man, vulnerable and real. And she was no longer just a cause. She was a woman who saw the good in him that he had thought was long dead. The moment was broken by a small voice from the hallway. "Mommy, I had a bad dream." Lily stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, her favorite stuffed bear clutched in one hand. Elena immediately went to her, scooping her up into a hug. "It's okay, Mija. I'm right here." Julian watched them, a strange ache in his chest. This was what was at stake, this small, fierce family and the haven they had built. He turned back to the whiteboard, his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He wasn't just fighting Marcus anymore. He was fighting for them. The breakthrough came 2 days later. Julian had been cross-referencing property tax records with incorporation filings, a tedious, mind-numbing task. But then he saw it. A name. A signature on a tax assessment for Evergreen Holdings that was almost illegible, but not quite. Arthur Kendrick. He knew that name. Kendrick was a low-level accountant at their old company, a nervous man who was always sweating, always terrified of Marcus. Marcus had likely used him as a straw man, the public face of a company that was supposed to be anonymous. He found Kendrick living in a small suburban tract house, the lawn neatly manicured. When Julian knocked on the door, Kendrick opened it a crack, his face turning pale with shock when he saw who it was. "Vance," he whispered, trying to shut the door. Julian put his foot in the way. "I just want to talk, Arthur. About Evergreen Holdings. About Marcus." Fear warred with something else in Kendrick's eyes. Guilt. "I can't," he stammered. "He'll ruin me." "He's already ruining people," Julian said, his voice even. "A community center. Families. Children. They have 1 day left before they're evicted. All because of a signature you put on a piece of paper." Kendrick's resolve crumbled. He let Julian in. Over the next hour, in a living room filled with family photos and the smell of fabric softener, the whole story came out. Marcus had coerced Kendrick into being the signatory, using a combination of financial incentives and veiled threats about his job and his pension. Kendrick had the documents, the proof that Evergreen Holdings was nothing more than a shell, illegally backdated and fraudulently funded directly from Thorne Development's accounts. It was the weak link. It was everything. Julian left with a copy of the files, his heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and dread. He had the weapon. Now he had to use it. He drove straight to Thorne Tower, the gleaming monument to everything Marcus had stolen. He didn't ask for an appointment. He walked past the receptionist, his name and his newfound confidence a key that opened every door. He found Marcus in his penthouse office, staring out at the city like an emperor surveying his domain. "Julian," Marcus said, turning slowly, a predatory smile on his face. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to beg for your little charity project?" "I'm here to offer you a deal, Marcus," Julian said, placing the folder of Kendrick's documents on the vast, polished desk. Marcus glanced at the folder, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. The color drained from his face. "Kendrick," he spat, the name a curse. "That sniveling little coward." "He was scared," Julian said. "But he was more scared of what you were doing to innocent people. You've become a monster, Marcus." "Don't you dare preach to me about morality," Marcus snarled, shoving the folder back across the desk. "You were always too weak for this business, too sentimental. I built this empire while you were hiding from the world. And now that empire is about to come crashing down," Julian said calmly. "Wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. These documents will not only stop the eviction, they will put you in a courtroom for the next 10 years. Your shareholders will love that." Marcus stared at him, his mind racing, looking for an angle, a way out. Julian could see the calculations in his cold eyes. "Here's the deal," Julian said, pressing his advantage. "You will sell the Eastside Community Center building to a new foundation I am creating. You will sell it for $1. You will also make a public, unsolicited donation to that foundation for $10 million as a gesture of your commitment to the community. In return, these documents will remain private. You get to keep your empire. But I will be watching you, and the next time you try to hurt people for profit, I will burn it all to the ground. Do we have an agreement?" It was a checkmate. Marcus was trapped, and he knew it. The silence in the office stretched on, thick with hatred. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, Marcus capitulated. "Get out of my office," he whispered, his voice hoarse with defeat. Julian turned and walked out, not looking back. He had won. He had faced the ghost of his past and vanquished him. But as he rode the elevator down, he felt no elation, only a quiet, profound sense of release. The fight was over. Now, he could finally start to build something new. When he returned to the center, it was late. The eviction was scheduled for the next morning. The mood inside was somber, a mix of despair and frantic activity as people packed boxes, their faces grim. Elena was in the main room, directing volunteers, her own face a mask of exhaustion and heartbreak. When she saw Julian enter, she walked over to him, her shoulders slumped. "Any news?" she asked, though her tone made it clear she expected none. Julian didn't say anything. He simply handed her a piece of paper. It was a contract, freshly printed. A deed of sale for the building, from Evergreen Holdings to the newly formed Vance Foundation, for the sum of $1. Signed by Arthur Kendrick as authorized signatory and countersigned by Julian. Elena stared at it, her eyes scanning the text, uncomprehending at first. Then her eyes widened. She looked up at him, her lips parted in disbelief. What is this?" "It means you're not going anywhere," he said softly. "It means this place is yours. Forever." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and gratitude. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, and for the first time in 5 years, Julian Vance felt like he was home. He held her tightly, the scent of coffee and determination filling his senses. Around them, the volunteers had stopped packing. A slow, stunned silence fell over the room, followed by a dawning wave of cheers and applause. Lily, who had been watching from a corner, ran to them and wrapped her small arms around both their legs, completing the circle. Julian looked down at the top of her head, then over at Elena's tear-streaked, smiling face. He had spent years building a fortress of solitude, believing it was the only way to protect his wounded heart. But he had been wrong. True strength wasn't in walls. It was in connection. It was in fighting for something more than yourself. It was in this room, with these people, with this woman and her daughter. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had found his purpose. The weeks that followed were a blur of joyous, constructive activity. The $10 million donation from Thorne Development arrived, an anonymous gift to the public, but a clear signal of surrender to Julian and Elena. The news of the center's salvation spread through the community, and a new energy filled the old brick building. Julian, true to his word, poured his resources and his intellect into the new foundation. But his work wasn't remote. He didn't sit in a downtown office managing assets. His office remained the dusty storage closet at the center. He was there every day, not as a benefactor, but as a partner. He helped Elena draft new program proposals, set up a state-of-the-art computer lab for job training, and even spent a Saturday on a ladder, helping repaint the mural on the outside wall. He and Elena fell into a comfortable rhythm, a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared vision. Their late-night work sessions often bled into quiet conversations about their lives, their dreams, their fears. He learned about her childhood in a struggling immigrant family, her fierce determination to give back to the community that had raised her. She learned about his passion for creation, the joy he had once found in building things that helped people, a joy that was slowly returning, stronger and more authentic than before. The attraction that had sparked between them in the heat of the crisis now had space to breathe, to grow into something deeper and more meaningful. It was in the way she would bring him a coffee without asking, just the way he liked it. It was in the way he would instinctively put a hand on her back to guide her through a crowded room. It was in the lingering glances, the shared smiles, the easy silences. One afternoon, he was on the floor of the main room, completely engrossed in helping Lily build a towering, structurally unsound castle out of wooden blocks. He was explaining the principles of cantilevered design to a very serious 6-year-old when Elena knelt beside them. "You're good at that," she said, her voice soft. "Physics?" he asked, carefully placing another block. "It's just a set of rules. Predictable." "No," she said, her eyes warm. "This. Being here. You fit, Julian." He looked up at her, and the noisy, chaotic room seemed to fade away. All he could see was her face, the kindness in her eyes. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart were well and truly gone, dismantled not by a grand assault, but by the steady, quiet presence of this woman and her daughter. "Elena," he began, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. He had to tell her. He had to know if this feeling, this sense of rightness, was real. Before he could continue, Lily placed a final precarious block on top of their tower. "It's finished," she declared. "It's our castle." She looked from Julian to her mother, a wise, knowing smile on her face. "It's for all of us." The simple, profound truth of her words hung in the air. Julian looked at Elena, and he saw his future. It wasn't in a sterile mansion or a high-tech boardroom. It was here, in this noisy, imperfect, beautiful place. It was with them. He reached out and took Elena's hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He didn't need to say the words. She knew. She squeezed his hand, her smile a silent promise. The castle wobbled, and then, with a gentle crash, it tumbled down around them. But it didn't matter. They would build a new one, together. Something stronger, something real, something that would last forever. 2 years later, the Grand Astoria Ballroom looked exactly the same. The chandeliers dripped with crystal, the flowers were impossibly perfect, and the air hummed with the same frequency of wealth and power. But for Julian Vance, everything was different. He stood near the entrance, not as a ghost in the shadows, but as a man firmly planted in the light. He wore a tuxedo that was impeccably tailored, but his posture was relaxed, his smile genuine. He wasn't here as a keynote speaker or a reclusive curiosity. He was here as the co-chair of the event, alongside Elena. The annual gala was no longer for a single community center, but for the City Alliance for Hope, the umbrella organization born from the Vance Foundation, which now supported dozens of similar grassroots initiatives across the metropolis. Elena moved through the room with a confidence and grace that seemed to radiate from her core. She was a force of nature, connecting donors with program directors, speaking with an unshakable passion about the real-world impact of their work. She caught Julian's eye from across the room and gave him a smile that made his heart ache with a quiet, profound joy. Lily, now 8 years old and looking impossibly grown up in a dark blue velvet dress, was by his side, her hand tucked securely in his. She was a little overwhelmed by the scale of it all, but her eyes were bright with excitement. "Is this where you gave the angry speech?" she whispered, her voice loud enough for only him to hear. Julian chuckled. "This is the place," he confirmed. "Do you think I should give another one?" Lily considered this with the gravity only a child can muster. "No," she decided. "You don't look angry anymore. You look happy." He squeezed her hand. "I am happy." A man approached them, his hand extended. It was the same man with the florid face who, 2 years ago, had tossed his car keys at Julian. Recognition and a deep, mortified shame dawned in his eyes. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice husky. I don't know if you remember me." "I remember," Julian said, his tone gentle, devoid of accusation. He shook the man's hand. "I wanted to apologize," the man stammered. "That night, your speech, it made me think. I was an arrogant fool. I've since become a monthly donor to the Alliance. My wife and I volunteer at the food bank on weekends." He looked down, unable to meet Julian's gaze. "You changed me, sir." "You changed yourself," Julian corrected him kindly. "All I did was hold up a mirror." The man nodded. His eyes filled with gratitude, and moved on. Julian watched him go, a sense of wonder settling over him. He had thought that night was about tearing something down, about exposing the hypocrisy of a corrupt system. But he had been wrong. It had been about building something up. It had started a chain reaction of change, not just in his own life, but in the lives of people he would never even know. Later that evening, he and Elena stood on the terrace, looking out at the glittering cityscape. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the warmth of the ballroom. "It's a good night," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's a perfect night," he agreed, wrapping his arm around her. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the endless stream of headlights on the streets below. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "Your old life? The power? The prestige of being on top of that world?" Julian thought for a moment. He thought of the cold, sterile perfection of his mansion, the endless, meaningless meetings, the gnawing emptiness that had been his constant companion. He contrasted it with the life he had now, the chaotic warmth of their home, a comfortable, book-filled house in a normal neighborhood, the sound of Lily's laughter, the feeling of Elena's hand in his, the deep, unshakable sense of purpose that got him out of bed every morning. "I wasn't on top of that world," he said, his voice filled with a certainty that was absolute. "I was buried beneath it." He turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his hand. "This," he whispered, his gaze taking in her, the city, the future. "This is what it feels like to be on top of the world." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss filled with the quiet promises of 1,000 more nights, just like this one. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, because their work was hard and the world was still full of challenges. But it was a real ending, an earned one. A man who had been mistaken for a valet had found his true worth, not in a balance sheet or a title, but in the simple, powerful act of building a life of love and purpose. And for Julian Vance, that was more than enough. It was everything.